The world, for Dr. Evan Reed, was a place of cold, hard logic. It was a place of measurable data, of empirical evidence, of cause and effect. He was a cardiac surgeon at the pinnacle of his field, a man whose hands, steady as a rock, held the power of life and death. His life was a testament to the scientific method. You identify a problem, you apply a solution, you get a result. There was no room for faith, for miracles, or for anything that could not be proved on a chart or seen under a microscope. He was a staunch atheist, a man who saw belief as a crutch for the weak, a flimsy excuse for a world that was, at its core, a random, uncaring chaos. He would scoff at patients who, before a surgery, would whisper a prayer or clutch a worn rosary. To him, these were futile gestures. The only thing that saved lives in his operating room was a scalpel, a steady hand, and years of relentless scientific training. He was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly alone in a city that worshipped success. His path to this cynicism was not one of youthful rebellion, but of adult disillusionment. Evan grew up in a household where faith was as central as the dinner table. His mother, a devout woman, had filled his childhood with Bible stories and Sunday school lessons. He believed, as a child, in a benevolent God, in a world where good was rewarded and prayer was answered. His father, a kind, good-natured man who worked as a high school history teacher, was the anchor of their family, a man whose quiet faith was a living example of a life well lived. On quiet Sunday mornings, they would walk to their local church, the scent of his father's pipe tobacco and the sound of his mother's humming a warm, comforting presence. Evan believed in a world where a good man like his father would be blessed. A world where love and faith were an unbreakable shield against the world's sorrows. He saw his father's gentle hands, his tired smile, and his unwavering kindness as proof that a life of goodness was a life of quiet dignity. But then came a string of devastating personal failures that shattered his worldview. His father was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. Evan prayed, his mother prayed, his entire church community prayed. They filled their home with the sound of desperate, frantic pleas for a miracle. Evan, a young boy of 10, would kneel by his father's bed, his small hands clasped, tears streaming down his face, begging for a sign. He would sit in church, his eyes fixed on the stained glass windows, waiting for a flash of light, a thundering voice, a moment of divine intervention. But the prayers went unanswered, and his father, the man he idolized, the man who was a living testament to a good life, wasted away. Evan watched, helpless and heartbroken, as the man who had taught him how to ride a bike and to be a good man was taken by an illness that no one could explain, a life that no one could save, the injustice of it all. The complete and total lack of response to their pleas turned his faith to dust. He threw himself into his medical studies, determined to find a way to save lives that God, in his mind, had failed to save. He would become a man who could fix what was broken, a man who could control what was uncontrollable. He would become a surgeon. Years later, his personal life was a wreck, a testament to the fact that his cold logic could not be applied to matters of the heart. His marriage to a fellow medical student, a woman who once admired his single-minded dedication, fell apart. In the beginning, their love was a shared ambition, a mutual respect for the grueling demands of their careers. But as the years passed, his emotional detachment, his inability to express anything beyond professional satisfaction or intellectual frustration, became a chasm between them. He came home one night to find her bags packed. She was leaving him for a man who could be emotionally present, a man who could talk about his feelings, and who, ironically, was a priest. Evan took the loss with a grim, detached cynicism. He had dedicated his life to a career that demanded his entire being, and he had no time for emotional entanglements. His emotional walls, once a defense mechanism, had become a fortress, impenetrable and complete. He was a man who lived a life of routine, of sterile surgical rooms, of a quiet, empty apartment in Boston. He had everything he had ever wanted, everything he had ever worked for, but he was hollow. His life was a success story in the eyes of the world, but in his own eyes, it was a profound, quiet failure. And in this desolate, cynical world he had created for himself, a young boy with a broken heart was about to arrive and turn his entire life upside down. The boy's name was Leo. He was a vibrant, bright-eyed 6-year-old with a laugh that could light up a room, but a laugh was all he had left. His heart, a small, fragile muscle, was failing. He had a rare and complex congenital heart defect, a condition so severe that other surgeons had turned him away, calling his case inoperable. His parents, desperate and heartbroken, had traveled across the country to seek out Dr. Evan Reed. He was their last hope, a man known for his willingness to take on the impossible. But as Evan reviewed the boy's chart, he felt a familiar cold wave of dread. The odds were abysmal. The procedure was risky, complex, and filled with 100 different ways it could go wrong. He wanted to turn him away, to tell the family that he was sorry, but that he could not help them. He did not want to be a part of another tragedy. But then he met Leo's mother, a woman named Anna. She was a devout Catholic, a woman whose faith was a living, breathing thing. She sat in his sterile office, her hands clasped, her eyes shining with a quiet, powerful conviction. "Dr. Reed," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "I know my son's case is difficult. I know it's risky, but I know you can do it. I have faith in you." Evan felt a pang of a familiar, bitter irony. He wanted to laugh. Faith in him. He was a man who had no faith in anything. But he was a man who could not resist the challenge, a man who was a magnet for the impossible. He looked at the woman's face, at the profound, quiet certainty in her eyes, and he saw something he had not seen in a long time: hope, and a deep, almost unconscious desire to save her from the pain he knew was coming. He agreed to take the case. The day before the surgery, Anna came to his office. She was alone, her face pale, her hands trembling. She did not bring a medical form or a new test result. She brought him a gift. It was a small, unassuming silver medal on a simple chain. It was a miraculous medal, a small, quiet symbol of the Virgin Mary's intercession. Evan took it, his hands cold and detached. He looked at the image of the woman on the medal, her serene face a stark contrast to his cold, cynical one. He wanted to scoff, to tell her that this was not medicine, that this was not science, that this was a useless, desperate gesture. But he saw the hope in her eyes, and he could not bring himself to do it. He put the medal in the breast pocket of his surgical jacket, a small, useless piece of metal against the background of a high-stakes, life-or-death surgery. He told himself he was doing it out of professional courtesy, a small, compassionate gesture for a woman who was a victim of her own delusion. He told himself that he was a doctor, and he would save her son with his hands, with his skill, with his science. Not with a prayer, not with a medal, and not with a God he did not believe in. He was a man who believed in a world of cause and effect, and he was about to prove that his world was the only one that mattered. He was a man who was about to be proven profoundly, completely wrong. The air in the operating room was a cold, sterile breath of pure science. It hummed with the quiet, methodical rhythm of technology, the soft, continuous beep of the heart monitor, the faint rush of the ventilator, the low, steady drone of the fluorescent lights. Evan stood over Leo, a small, still form on the surgical table, a universe of fragile life in the palm of his hands. His surgical team moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, a well-oiled machine of highly trained professionals. They were his world, his sanctuary of logic and reason. In here, nothing was left to chance. Every incision was calculated. Every stitch was a precise act of will. There was no room for error, no place for doubt. This was a realm where Evan Reed, the brilliant, arrogant surgeon, was king. Leo's condition, a complex transposition of the great arteries and a ventricular septal defect, was a textbook nightmare. Other surgeons had called it inoperable, a puzzle with no solution. But Evan, a man who lived for the impossible, saw it as a challenge, a chance to prove his genius. Eve spent weeks poring over the boy's scans, running simulations, and rehearsing the procedure in his mind. He knew every millimeter of Leo's tiny heart, every fragile vein and artery. He had a plan, a precise, calculated roadmap to a successful operation. The team worked in perfect unison. A nurse handed him a scalpel, its cold steel a familiar weight. In his hand, he made the first incision, a clean, confident line, and the procedure began. For the next 2 hours, he was in his element, a man in a world of his own making. His hands, steady and precise, moved with an almost balletic grace, a symphony of skill and concentration. He was not a doctor, he was a god, a man who could take a broken heart and, with nothing more than his hands and his will, make it whole again. He believed in himself, in his science, and in the power of his logic. But then, the predictable world of science began to unravel. It started with a small, almost imperceptible blip on the heart monitor. Evan, his eyes fixed on the surgical field, ignored it. It was a normal fluctuation, a small glitch in the rhythm of the heart. But then the blips became more frequent, more frantic, a staccato rhythm of panic that filled the silent, sterile room. The heart monitor, once a steady, comforting presence, was now a source of dread. The boy's heart rate began to plummet, a rapid, terrifying descent into a flatline. "Vitals are dropping," a nurse said, her voice a tense whisper. Evan, his hands now trembling, tried every technique he knew. He tried to restart the heart, he tried to correct the rhythm, he tried to force it to beat again. But nothing worked. The boy's heart was still, a small silent monument to a life that was now gone. The surgical team, once a well-oiled machine, descended into a state of quiet panic. They knew what this meant. They had seen it 100 times before. This was a tragedy. This was a failure. This was death. Evan, a man who had always prided himself on his control, felt his world crumbling around him. He was no longer a god. He was a man who was helpless, a man who was a witness to another life being taken, another family being destroyed. He stood there, his hands still over the boy's chest, his mind a blank slate of defeat. He was not a doctor. He was a dog. Failure. He had promised Aina that he would save her son, and now he had failed. He felt the cold, hard weight of a familiar, bitter reality. The world was a chaotic, uncaring place, and all his science, all his logic, all his skill, was no match for the raw, brutal power of a universe that was a random, uncaring chaos. But then, as he stood there, defeated and heartbroken, something impossible happened. He felt a sudden, strange heat in his pocket. It was a warmth that defied the cold, sterile air of the operating room. It was a sensation that was both familiar and impossible, and it was emanating from the miraculous metal that Aina had given him, the small, useless piece of metal that he had scoffed at and put in his pocket. As the heat intensified, a sudden, blinding light, a soft, golden glow, filled the surgical room. The light was not from the fluorescent lights, but from a source that was both internal and external, a light that seemed to be a part of the very air he breathed. And within the light, a fleeting, luminous image of a woman appeared. It was the Virgin Mary, a woman in a blue robe, her face serene and loving, her hands extended in peace over the boy's chest. Her presence was not a hallucination. It was a profound living reality. She was a woman who was a testament to a love that was bigger than his logic, a love that was bigger than his science. She did not speak with words, but in his mind, he heard a voice. It was a quiet, loving voice that was both a whisper and a thunder, a voice that was both a question and a command. It said, "Have faith." The words were a direct confrontation with everything he believed in, a profound, unshakable truth that had been spoken to him, a man who had no faith in anything. And in that moment, as the woman's serene face looked at him with a profound maternal compassion, something inside him broke. Not his heart, not his logic, but his cynicism. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and he was left with nothing but a profound, unshakable sense of awe. The miracle was not a sudden resurrection, but a quiet, slow-burning fire of grace. As the woman's serene face faded and the light receded, Evan's hands, which had been trembling, became steady. The boy's heart monitor, which had been a flat line of despair, began to beat again. Not with a weak, fluttering rhythm, but with a strong, steady, powerful beat. The vitals, which had been plummeting, began to stabilize, then to rise, then to return to a normal, healthy rhythm. The surgical team, once in a state of quiet panic, was now in a state of stunned, profound shock. They looked at the heart monitor, then at Evan, then back at the heart monitor, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was an impossible, illogical thing. A heart that had failed, a boy who was dead, was now alive. They had seen it with their own eyes. They had seen it with their own hands. But they had no explanation for it. They called it a medical anomaly, a statistical improbability, a fluke of nature. But Evan, a man who had believed in nothing, a man who had believed that the world was a place of chaos and despair, knew the truth. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt. He knew what he had heard. And he knew, with a profound, unshakable certainty, that he was no longer a man of science, but a man who was a witness to a miracle. The aftermath was a blur of activity. The rest of the surgery was completed with a flawless, confident ease. The boy's heart, which had been a weak, fragile muscle, was now a strong, healthy one. The team, once in a state of shock, was now in a state of professional triumph. Evan was a hero. He was a genius. He had done the impossible. The hospital's PR team was already drafting a press release, a story about the brilliant surgeon who had saved a life that no one else could save. The chief of surgery, a man who had doubted Evan's arrogant confidence, came to his office and shook his hand. "You did it, Evan," he said, his voice thick with a genuine, powerful awe. "You did the impossible." But Evan, a man who had built his life on certainty, felt like a fraud. He was a man who had been praised for a miracle he did not perform, a man who had been given a gift that he did not deserve. He was a man who, for the first time in his life, was humbled. The boy's recovery was swift and complete. He was no longer a boy with a broken heart, but a boy who was alive, a boy who was a testament to a grace that was bigger than his illness, bigger than his logic, and bigger than his science. The nurses and doctors, who had seen it all, were in a state of awe. They called him the miracle boy. They called his case the miracle case. But Evan, a man who had been a witness to the miracle, felt a profound, quiet despair. His world was shattered. He was a man who had believed in a world of cause and effect, and he had been shown a world that was a place of grace. He was a man who had believed that he was a god, and he had been shown that he was nothing more than a witness. He was a man who had believed that he could fix everything, and he had been shown that some things of profound, unexplainable grace, were not for him to fix, but for him to be a witness to. He was a man who was alone, a man who was haunted, a man who was a fraud. He was a man who was about to begin a new journey, a journey of a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. The days that followed the surgery were a slow, agonizing descent into a new kind of world for Evan. The old one, a place of certainty and sterile control, was gone. The new one was a place of questions, a place of ghosts, a place of impossible, unshakable truth. He walked the halls of the hospital like a man in a dream, his mind replaying the moments in the operating room. He would look at a patient's chart and see not just a diagnosis, but a story, a family, a life that was a part of a bigger, more complex tapestry he could not understand. He was a doctor, but his science no longer felt like a god. It felt like a tool, a useful but limited instrument in a world that was a place of grace. The first step in his new journey was to confront the source of the miracle. He went to visit the boy and his mother in the hospital room, a small, sterile sanctuary of hope and peace. Anna, her face radiant with a joy that was both profound and infectious, was sitting on a chair next to her son's bed. Leo, the boy who was once a small, still form on a surgical table, was now a vibrant, bright-eyed child, playing with a small toy car, his laugh a symphony of life and a profound, living testament to the grace that had saved him. Anna stood up and hugged Evan, her arms a warm, loving presence around his cold, detached body. "Dr. Reed," she said, her voice thick with tears of gratitude, "you saved my son's life. You did the impossible. We will never be able to thank you enough." Evan, a man who had built his life on certainty, felt like a fraud. He was a man who had been praised for a miracle he did not perform, a man who had been given a gift that he did not deserve. He could not look at the woman, her eyes shining with a gratitude he could not accept. He looked at the boy, at his small, vibrant life, and he felt a profound, quiet despair. He was a man who had been a witness to a miracle, and he was a man who was a fraud. But then, Anna did something that was a direct confrontation with his own lack of faith. She took his hand, her hands a warm, loving presence around his cold, detached one. "I prayed the entire time, Dr. Reed," she said, her voice a low, gentle whisper. "I prayed to the Virgin Mary, and I asked her to have faith for my son and for you when you could not. I asked her to be with you in the operating room, and I asked her to guide your hands and to guide your heart." The words were a hammer blow to his cold, cynical heart. He was a man who had believed in a world of cause and effect, and he had been shown a world that was a place of grace. He was a man who had believed that he was a god, and he had been shown that he was nothing more than a witness. He was a man who had believed that he could fix everything, and he had been shown that some things of profound, unexplainable grace, were not for him to fix, but for him to be a witness to. He was a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to begin a new journey, a journey of a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. The internal struggle was a slow, agonizing descent into a new kind of world for Evan. He would spend hours in his empty apartment, his mind replaying the moments in the operating room. He would look at the miraculous medal that he had taken out of his pocket and placed on his nightstand, and he would see not just a small, useless piece of metal, but a symbol of a profound, unexplainable truth. He would try to rationalize it with every possible logical explanation. The heat, he told himself, was a result of a subconscious anxiety, a phantom feeling in a moment of stress. The vision, he told himself, was a hallucination, a side effect of fatigue and a heightened state of stress. The boy's recovery, he told himself, was a medical anomaly, a statistical improbability, a fluke of nature. But he knew, with a profound, unshakable certainty, that all of his science, all of his logic, all of his reason was no match for the truth that had been spoken to him. He was a man who had believed in nothing, a man who had believed that the world was a place of chaos and despair. And he had been shown a world that was a place of grace. He was a man who was haunted. He was haunted by the image of the woman's serene face, her eyes filled with a profound maternal compassion. He was haunted by the voice that had spoken to him, a quiet, loving voice that was both a whisper and a thunder. He was haunted by the warmth of the metal in his pocket, a warmth that had been a physical, living thing in a place of cold, sterile science. His scientific mind, once a source of comfort and certainty, was now an enemy, a relentless, analytical voice that would not, provide him with a logical answer. He would spend hours in his lab, a sanctuary of reason that was now a prison of questions, trying to find a scientific explanation for what he had seen. But every test, every analysis, every theory he came up with failed. The rose petal, the miraculous metal, the vision, the recovery. It was all a contradiction of his world. And in that contradiction, he found himself, a man who was a doctor, but was now a man who was a seeker. The journey began in the dark. Evan, a man who was terrified of being seen, would leave his apartment in the dead of night, a man who was a ghost in the city that he had once owned. He would walk to a small, unassuming Catholic church on the outskirts of town, a place that was a world away from his sterile, logical one. He would sit in the back pews, a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He would not pray. He would just watch. He would watch the people who came to the church, the people who came with their hopes and their fears, their joy and their despair. He would watch them kneel, their hands clasped, their heads bowed, and he would see not a weak, desperate gesture, but a profound, powerful act of faith. He would watch the quiet dignity of the people, the quiet certainty of their belief, and he would feel a profound, quiet despair. He was a man who had believed in nothing, a man who had believed that he was a god, and he had been shown that he was nothing more than a witness. He was a man who was a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. The small human moments were a slow, quiet symphony of change. He began to see his patients not just as cases, but as people with fears, hopes, and families. He would sit with them for an extra moment, his hands no longer a cold, detached presence, but a warm, compassionate one. He would ask them about their lives, their families, their fears. He would listen to their stories, and he would see not just a diagnosis, but a story, a family, a life that was a part of a bigger, more complex tapestry he could not understand. His colleagues, who had once known him as the arrogant, cold surgeon, noticed the change. They would see him sitting with a patient's family, his hands clasped, his head bowed, and they would be in a state of stunned, profound shock. One day, a nurse, a woman who had worked with him for years, a woman who had known him as a man of science, came to his office. "Evan," she said, her voice a low, gentle whisper, "what has happened to you? You're different." Evan, a man who had no words for what had happened to him, just smiled. "I'm just a doctor," he said. "I'm just a man." But he knew the truth. He was a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls, the quiet. Vow was a slow, quiet descent into a new kind of world for Evan. One night, he was in the back of the church, a place of quiet, dignified reverence. The lights were low, the air was still, and the only sound was the soft, continuous hum of the furnace. He was a man who had built his life on certainty, a man who had no faith in anything. But then he looked at the small, beautiful statue of the Virgin Mary, a woman who was a testament to a love that was bigger than his logic, a love that was bigger than his science. And in that moment, he felt a profound, quiet despair. He was a man who had believed in nothing, A man who had believed that the world was a place of chaos and despair, and he had been shown a world that was a place of grace. He was a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. He was a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. He was a man who was a witness, a man who was a seeker, a man who was a believer. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. The path from secret seeker to open believer was not a straight one for Evan. It was a winding, difficult road, filled with moments of doubt and profound uncertainty. He spent months in a state of silent spiritual turmoil, a man who was in the middle of a scientific and theological crisis. He was a man who was a doctor, and he was a man who was a seeker. He was a man who was about to become a doctor, not just of bodies, but of souls. He had found a mentor in a local priest, a kind, old man named Father Michael, who had been a witness to Evan's silent, midnight pilgrimages to the back of his church. Father Michael, a man who had seen it all, had not scolded Evan for his cynicism. He had simply sat with him, his hands clasped, his head bowed, and he had listened. He had listened to Evan's frantic scientific explanations of what he had seen, and he had listened to the quiet, profound despair of a man who could not reconcile his world with the world that he had been shown. He had listened to Evan's story of the heat, the light, the woman, and the voice. He had listened to the story of a man who was a witness to a miracle, and he had been a man who was a witness to a miracle. Father Michael, a man of quiet, powerful faith, had not given Evan a book on theology. He had given him a book on the lives of the saints, and he had told him to read it, not with his mind, but with his heart. He had told him that the saints were not gods, but people who had been broken, people who had been lost, and people who had been found. He had told him that the saints were not a testament to their own power, but a testament to the power of a God who had given them a gift that was bigger than their own lives. He had told him that the saints were not a distraction from God, but a way to God, a way to a love that was bigger than any of us. Evan, a man who had always prided himself on his intelligence, was a man who was now a student. He read the book, not with his mind, but with his heart, and he found a world that he had never known before. He found a world that was a place of love, a place of grace, a place of hope. He found a world that was a place of people who were broken, people who were lost, and people who were found. He found a world that was a place of miracles, a world that was a place of grace. He found a world that was a place of faith. He found a world that was a place of hope. He found a world that was a place of love.